Witam na sesję 6, warsztaty pisania tekstów naukowych. Mam nadzieję, że jesteś zdrowy i wygodny. In session 6, we're going to look at structuring of your argument in academic articles or chapters of a PhD. And we'll look at 5 basic patterns of argument building that you're likely to see often. This slide you'll recognize from our previous lecture. This is the generic form of an article in the Anglo-American tradition. And I'll refer back to this basic form after we discuss each of the 5 typical forms of argument building over the rest of this lecture. Just to remind you here, in a lot of ways, the introduction is the most complex and most succinct piece of writing that you'll have to undertake. It's hard to overstate the importance of getting your introduction right to position the reader to both appreciate what you have to say, to understand its importance, and to be able to adequately follow the rest of the argument and conclusion that you present. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to look at 5 patterns of argument building: the lacuna, the problem to solve, the straw man, resolving a debate, and the need for comparison. And these are just short titles, and I'll explain each in due course. I would stress here that there are indeed many other patterns of argument building that you will have encountered and will encounter in the future. I would argue that these are perhaps the 5 most common, but there's certainly room for debate there. What I want to do is to stimulate you to reflect critically on the academic literature that you are reading in preparation for your PhD, and to try and understand not just passively what you're being told by the author, but how the author has constructed their own argument and positioned themselves within the sort of wider discourse on their topic. To begin with, the lacuna is perhaps the most sort of common approach. The word lacuna itself is a Latin word which means a kind of empty space or gap. If I were to say that you're preparing a piece of research which addresses a lacuna in our current knowledge, it simply means you're looking at something that people haven't looked at or indeed haven't looked at critically in the past. Now, the term lacuna itself seems to be more favored by North American historians than their British, Australian, New Zealander, and other Anglophone equivalents. British academics tend to say, refer to, for example, a gap in the historiography of the discipline where history, or in even sort of wordier phrases in other social sciences, simply something not yet addressed, for example, would be another phrase. In a lot of ways, as I have already said, this is the kind of default approach. And I think most students begin preparing a PhD with the notion in mind that they're looking at something specifically because researchers in the past have failed to look at it. And really, if you're preparing a thesis chapter, an article on something new that we know nothing about, the real challenge is to justify why we should care. If at this point, over 100 years into the professional social sciences at universities throughout the Western world, no one has looked at this in the past, it does beg the question, why not? Is it simple oversight, or is it this is something that people haven't understood to be important in the past? And it's very easy to fall into this trap as a PhD student of thinking, I'm bringing new information to the academic community, and that alone should justify my work. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that does not justify your work. You really need to say, how does this relate to what we already know? how does it relate to other research being conducted right now, research that's been conducted in the past? How does it relate to other disciplines? You have to justify conducting the research. You can't just say, I'm bringing something new to the table because we haven't looked at it before. And this is really the burden of any piece of work which addresses something that's been overlooked or neglected or ignored in the past. You have to justify your work. Now, the positive side to this is that you can really make a name for yourself if you successfully open up a new field of study. Your work has the potential to be groundbreaking if you're the first person in a field. And indeed, some of the most successful academics in the social sciences are those who open up a new field, and then for the rest of their careers, what they find is that every following article, book, or PhD on that same topic has to begin with explaining how they were the ones to begin this new area of study and to proceed forward from there. Certainly in an academic environment where impact factors, that is to say, proof through references to your work that you have done something creative and important, are becoming more and more important, then it's great if you can really open up something new and be a point of reference for future academics. But it's not that easy, and these days, in the discipline of history, for example, it's genuinely difficult to find a topic which, on the one hand, is justifiably quite important, but on the other hand, hasn't been looked at all before. Now, there are certainly extra risks involved when you try and open up a new field of study, and you should think critically about these when you're preparing your PhD or work for publication. I mean, some of the most obvious risks here are that the work has been done before, but that it has been conducted and published in the medium of a language that you don't read or that you're not aware of. Certainly with, if I dare use this word, the Europeanization of research across European universities and Western universities in the last 30 and 40 years, it's much more common now to find academics in the social sciences working on topics that relate to different geographical regions of Europe. And it's not at all uncommon to find that academics who thought they were being very path-breaking in the last 10 or 20 years have actually gone out and published a piece of research which more or less had already been conducted and published in, say, German or French or Spanish at an earlier point in time. You really need to sort of communicate with academics that are familiar with what are the research interests and publications in other languages to ensure that you don't fall into this trap. You also may find that if you're looking at something that's sort of totally new or hasn't been examined by someone in your field before, that in fact what you're doing is actually working beyond your field. For example, you might find that what you're interested in as an historian or as an economist has in fact already been looked at from a different angle by a sociologist or a political theorist. Again, this might sound like an obvious risk of trying to break new ground, but it's certainly one that's relevant when you're starting off in academia preparing a PhD. People do fall into this trap. They set about to write a piece of economic history and realize halfway through that in fact a lot of work on this topic has already been done by political theorists, for example. Now, when you structure an article or a PhD chapter around a lacuna in our knowledge, as discussed in the previous slide, you will follow more or less the generic pattern of an article in the Anglo-American tradition, as discussed in the previous lecture. When you advance to structure an article around a problem we need to solve, or using other ways of forming an argument as discussed in the rest of this lecture, there are special considerations to take into account. And those are what you will find in the structure section of this lecture with reference to each further way of formulating an argument. I start with this method I term here the problem to solve, because when you finish your PhD, this is most likely the method you will use of formulating an argument for an early book, an early book chapter or article. You'll find that a PhD is far too large to condense down to a single article, and so you can select a piece of your PhD that relates to existing academic literature and present it as a problem to solve piece. What I mean by that is you start with the premise that people have been wondering about something. For example, people have speculated from what they have written in the past. They've speculated about a certain piece of knowledge that we don't yet have, and you feel like you can step in and you can clear that up. So unlike the lacuna, this is something where people do know about it and they have talked about it, but they've never addressed it directly. So what is the problem here? We have two kinds of problem. The first is two things we know are in conflict. So for example, we might say academics have proven in the 1500s it's harder to get credit. The rules for attaining credit are more strict. On the other hand, they have also proven that credit is used more frequently in that same time period. And so those two things we know seem to be in conflict. On the one hand, it's more difficult to get credit. On the other hand, people are using it more frequently. And how do you, as we say in English, square that circle? How do you resolve the tension between those two things that we think both are true, but they don't join up very well? That's a problem. Another problem we could solve is where we have an inferred answer. So for example, archaeologists might say in a particular time period, from a particular time period, we find a lot of coins buried in the ground. And from that, we might infer that, that the government or monarchy was producing more coins, but we haven't checked. Similarly, we might say economists have shown that the economy was doing very well, something which also tends to suggest that a lot of coins were being produced by the government or monarchy. So the problem to solve here is the problem of finding out specifically how many coins are produced. In the past, we've inferred that from archaeological finds or from the state of the economy, but we haven't directly investigated the actual number of coins produced. So that's where you step in and you solve this problem. People have been wondering about this. It's something we know about, people have thought about, but we haven't addressed it directly. Now you have to justify why this matters. That's typically pretty easy to do if people have already been talking around the topic without addressing it directly. You also need to indicate how does this relate to research findings we already have and prior speculation. And you need to indicate why no one has addressed this in the past. And that's something that's quite easy to forget about if you are writing your first article or book chapter. But it's very important to indicate why people haven't looked at this directly in the past. Maybe it's because the data hasn't been available before your research or for some other reason. In the argument, the first section needs to state clearly what we already know. It needs to ground us in what we already know. Further sections in the argument will need to advance what we know with the evidence at hand. This is where you bring your new evidence to bear, starting with the most general and ending with the most specific. And the conclusion needs to restate the problem and set out your solution. Now, I've included on the next slide an outline of an article and how this pattern may be observed in that article. I think it's important that you see it in action effectively as an example of how to match up one of these methods of building an argument with an actual piece of literature. The example I've used, and I suggest that if you have time, you could read this, perhaps read it very quickly, just to match up the points I give you here so that you have experience of deconstructing an article against one of these models. The example I've chosen is Caroline Barron's article, What Did Medieval London Merchants Read? In Martin Allen and Davis's Medieval Merchants and Money, published by the University of London Press. And this is an open access volume, and so from home, without logging in, you can go on the internet and access this chapter. You can download it and read it. So you'll note here that Caroline Barron is a very respected historian who's now in her 80s, was in her late 70s already when this was published. She more or less has taken this, used this solve a problem framework. So in her introduction, she says, look, there's a basic unanswered question. Previous views are only speculation. She engages in a literature review. She says, she indicates the kind of data she's going to use. These are two different lists of books we know that medieval London merchants possessed. She indicates her method, that she's going to compare the content of these lists. She's going to contrast that content with what we have in testamentary data. That's the information found in people's wills. She'll contextualize it, and she indicates the two authors who have previously done work in this area, Scott and Sutton. She's weak on advanced organizers in her introduction. If you recall, in the sort of generic form of an Anglo-American article, the introduction should finish with just a few sentences to say, we will proceed by looking at section 1, section 2, section 3, and indicate what will be in each section. I think sometimes that particularly academics of an older generation who are very well respected, as Professor Barron is, sometimes don't take the time to do all of these things. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact she's effectively skipped out her advanced organizers in the introduction. But when we come to the argument section, she actually has good advanced organizers there with phrases like, as for example here, section 1 of her argument begins, to look first at Scott's list. Notice section 2 begins, when we turn to consider, and so forth. So these are these little advanced organizer phrases which help join up the sections and paragraphs inside the article. So she systematically works her way through her data. Then in section 3, she takes that a bit further. She moves beyond what's in her main data sources and engages in a little bit of conjecture and draws some interim conclusions. For example, she indicates that Londoners like prayer books, historical compilations, and bureaucratic chronicles, as she calls them. She then moves on to a section where she discusses the kind of literature being written by Londoners for Londoners, and then finally finishes with a discussion of private collections and semi-public libraries. And because the argument section of her article is effectively a long answer to the question, what did medieval London merchants read, when it comes time for the conclusion, she has very little work left to do, because the article has systematically answered the question in a series of ways. And so the conclusion is one, it's effectively an epilogue that lasts for about 1 page, starting on page 69, in which she sort of says, this is the justification for ceasing our discussion at this chronological point. That is to say, with the rise in the publication of printed texts, as opposed to handwritten books. And finally, the effective conclusion is one very short paragraph on page 70, which, I mean, really just says, look, I'm reminding you what the question was. She restates the question, and I'm reminding you that I have already answered it and done so thoroughly. Now, Model 3, we're looking here at a more complex type of article, a PhD chapter. When we say a straw man or a straw man article, we're referring to a straw man as a form of argument and informal fallacy based on giving the impression that we are refuting an opponent's argument. We're giving the impression that we are correcting some existing mistake in our knowledge. But it's a very specific term, straw man, because effectively we're dealing with a fallacy where the argument we're refuting wasn't really directly made by that opponent. A good example here would be when you have a very old piece of literature, and that old piece of literature has mentioned the topic you're interested in without addressing it directly. And on the basis of that old piece of literature, and maybe just 2 or 3 sentences in which the author speculated about something, the people have just been repeating that speculation. And so when you write a straw man argument, you set up the author of that old piece of literature as a quote unquote straw man. You create this kind of you create this kind of opponent, and you're going to challenge their point of view. If I can give you an example here, we might say, in 1911, J.E. Lloyd suggested that the princes of Powys were traitors to the cause of Welsh nation building. Now, this is true. J.E. Lloyd did suggest that the princes of the Welsh Principality of Powys were traitors in this kind of national project of building an early Welsh state. But the fact is, he never wrote about the Principality of Powys. He only wrote about the neighboring Principality of Gwynedd. He only mentions Powys from time to time, and he made some guesses and some inferences. He implied certain things, and historians who, like J.E. Lloyd, have also since then not really looked at Powys, have just tended to repeat whatever Lloyd said. And so Lloyd becomes a kind of straw man, a so-called giant of Welsh history. He's a very famous academic. He's often referred to as the father of Welsh history. And so when we set up one of these old and famous academics as a straw man and challenge their supposed arguments, sometimes this is referred to as giant killing, because the famous old academic is the giant and you're going after them. Now again, in a straw man argument, you're setting your point of view up in opposition to a point of view of another academic, typically someone that's already deceased, someone very far in the past, who they may not have directly discussed your topic, but they made some guesses, and you think that their guesses were wrong. And so you kind of effectively pretend that they had taken a strong view on this and that you're going to overturn that view. Now, there are pros and cons to this. The pro to this, the main pro being a positive side, is that you're updating the current state of academic knowledge. You say, oh, J.E. Lloyd had this wrong, and we must correct this terrible mistake that was made, 100 years ago in Welsh history. The reality is, J.E. Lloyd is long since dead. All of his work has been picked over, and little bits of it have been turned over throughout the years. And really what you're challenging are some guesses that he made. And so it's really a straw man argument. You're attributing to this long deceased academic more authority than they would have claimed for themselves. And so really what you're doing is you're, by challenging that straw man, you are using it as a framework within which to update our current state of knowledge. Now, the negative here is, you can potentially be picking a fight with other academics, and you can potentially make some other academics look wrong. If, for example, people working now, people who are still alive now, are actively repeating these old guesses and misconceptions from an academic, say, 100 years ago, well, if you strongly go out and attack this straw man and say, no, I'm going to correct this mistake, then you really can inadvertently upset people who have been repeating that long-received wisdom. Another negative here is that you can look quite arrogant. Be careful if the kind of giant you're attacking is still alive or much loved. Oftentimes you find that academics are still out there. They're maybe 90 or 100 years old. But in fact, they still have students who are working and so forth, and so you can upset some people. And I've put an extra slide in here about the so-called non-straw man here. And this is when, if you would, this is a kind of bonus method of framing an argument. It's when you do the same thing, but you challenge directly. You challenge much more directly the work of a current academic. And if they're quite a famous current academic, this can still be a form of kind of giant killing, where you as the plucky young new person are going out to correct a mistake of some famous person. But be careful, because this can also very easily be conceived of as what we sometimes call a hit piece. That is to say, where you have an academic rival and you're trying to sort of belittle them and prove them wrong because you don't like them. And this does happen from time to time. So be careful. You don't want to write effectively, you don't want to write a hit piece. And things can be perceived as a hit piece when you're genuinely trying to just correct some mistake in historiography. Again, the phrase hit piece itself is a little bit over dramatic, but be careful. Language really matters here. If you're writing in response to a piece of literature by an academic who's still alive and active, then the type of phrases you might choose to use are like, they were misled by, they did not benefit from this new data that shows. So those phrases I put in green are ones that are suggesting effectively suggesting that other academic is wrong, but it's not their fault. They didn't have all of the information available to them. These phrases I put in red are much more direct. You might say of another academic, they've incorrectly characterized this data, they have misunderstood. Try and avoid those types of phrases. Again, at the beginning of your career, you might think, this is a good opportunity to get a little bit of publicity, to challenge someone. Maybe you feel really motivated. If you're a sociologist or a psychologist, you might even have a kind of certain political agenda to go challenge what you think is a damaging misunderstanding. But as academics, of course, we live in small worlds, and sometimes a few words have big consequences. Keep in mind that these are the same people who are going to be the academics you're challenging are the same people who will have parallel academic careers to you. When you send an article off to a journal for publication, it is typically examined by means of blind peer review. That is to say, they take the author's name off the literature and send it to a couple of other academics to assess, asking, is this worthy of publication? But the reality is our academic world is so small that most of the time the reviewers will know who you are anyway, because typically only a few academics be working on one narrow area of research at one time. Again, don't make people angry. If they know who you are and you've been cruel by writing a hit piece, they may well be very difficult when they're peer reviewing your work. The same goes for job interviews and grant applications. It's better to have friends. And even if you think, look, I can really aggressively challenge the conclusions of academic X, I don't have direct connections with them, keep in mind that academic X will still have friends. So there's a kind of tightrope to walk here between, on the one hand, genuinely bringing forth new data where you think you have proof that someone else is wrong, and you think that it's important that the accurate information get out there to the academic community, and on the other hand, don't upset people because it's a small world. You'll find that book reviews are often an outlet for criticism. Academics will be much more openly negative about one another in book reviews. Just to put my money where my mouth is here, I give you an example of a piece that I've written that's a piece that challenged directly another academic who's working now. These are some quotes from my article here on London's married women in debt litigation. With reference to Emma Hawkes's work, I've written confusion over the frequency of women's litigation relates to the persistent but erroneous suggestion that erroneous means in error, and I followed it by a direct quote of the historian without using her name. And then I've later written the first steps toward, and the rest of the sentence is the first steps toward investigating this topic were taken by, and then I have used the author's name. So I've avoided using the author's name where I'm directly challenging the previous conclusion, and I have used the author's name where I'm praising that this person first addressed this lacuna and opened up new research territory. It's a balancing act. And I give you a little bit more information here about the straw man argument. If you're thinking, what are the special concerns that I should have, particularly if I'm writing with reference to a living academic? You have to justify, is this topic still relevant? There's no point in picking a fight with a straw man or a living academic if the topic is one that's no longer important because it's been entirely outmoded by a new way of doing research, for example. You have to justify why do we really need to understand this correctly. It's not enough to say that person had it wrong. If you were in the field of history, for example, it's easy to say 100 years ago an academic had it wrong. Does it matter? And you have to provide references that demonstrate that incorrect conclusion is still being repeated by current academics. Therefore, it's still having an impact in our field. When it comes to the argument, with a straw man argument, where we're challenging, things that we attribute to someone probably from far in the past that might be wrong, move systematically from the most general to the most specific points made by the straw man. again, if we were talking about this example of J.E. Lloyd writing in 1911, he wrote a book about the history of Wales, but really, if you read it, he was writing about the Principality of Gwynedd. He only made guesses about the Principality of Powys. It's not really his fault that all of those guesses have been repeated again and again by other historians. But this argument section, if you were addressing that academic from 100 years ago, you would say, effectively, these are the guesses he's made and that have been repeated. You have to deal with them in the order from the most general to the most specific. If you're dealing with a kind of living academic, I've put here a not straw man, as in to say a male or female academic who's active right now, you need to locate the critical argument where the disputed claim was first made. You absolutely have to trace the idea back to its very origin. When did this academic first come up with the idea? The last thing you want to do is to effectively write a hit piece saying, look, this person has it wrong, and I'm going to prove it, only to later find out that it wasn't their idea in the first place, that they had received that idea from an even earlier academic and had only expanded upon it. So you really need to identify the source of the argument that you're challenging. And then you need to parallel the structure of that original argument when structuring your own argument, really on a kind of section by section or point by point basis. When it comes to the conclusion of one of these sort of straw man articles, you need to restate the old view and restate your new view, and it's the conclusion is your chance really to be conciliatory. I mean, it should be obvious that also in the conclusion you need to state the wider implications and why it's important to get this right and so forth. But also, this is your time to be conciliatory. Now, the fourth way of building an argument is resolving a debate. And as I move through these, you'll notice that each method of building an argument I discuss is a little more complex than the one before it. So resolving a debate, we all know that academics sometimes disagree. This is effectively the next step after the straw man argument. Say, academic A builds an argument, academic B challenges that argument, and then that creates an opportunity for an article or a PhD chapter that resolves that argument. Okay, we have two options, differing points of view. Can I bring new evidence to bear that will settle this? The pros are, if you're writing an article or a PhD chapter that's part of an ongoing debate, you will get a lot of attention from your peers, much more so than if you, beavering away in the archive, decide you're going to address some lacuna. If you're addressing a lacuna or gap in our current knowledge, job one is just to establish that we should have been looking at it in the past. And so it might be years before that kind of article becomes talked about, becomes referenced by other academics. When it comes to a debate piece, those are great in the sense that everyone interested in this debate will be interested in your article. You have a ready-made audience. It has the potential to get into better journals. Weaker, or shall we say younger, less established academics sometimes get into very good journals if they have new evidence that contributes to a debate currently between more famous academics. This can even be a kind of backdoor into a specific journal. Say there's one really famous journal you're dying to get into, you think it's an important journal in your field, it has a great impact factor. Well, if you send them a piece of literature and say, your journal has been the journal in which this debate is unfolded, it's the journal people go to for information on this social science topic, and then follow that up by telling the editor, look, here's my contribution to that important argument, sometimes you can slip into quite a good journal. Also think about impact factor. All of these first three pros affect impact factor. Impact factor is a mathematical number which is derived by looking at how frequently something you have written is referenced in other academic publications, journals, books, and so forth. Journals themselves also have an impact factor. How often are articles from that one journal referenced in other journals, books, and publications? And if you jump in on a big debate, then you can generate a good impact factor. And increasingly, impact factors are used in assessing job applicants, for example, or grant applicants. There's some negatives here to trying to resolve a debate. You need to be perfect. If your data is going to be scrutinized by the best minds in the field in the midst of an ongoing debate, then believe me, people will find problems with your data. They will certainly notice if you haven't considered all of the possible shortcomings of your own data. And so you really need to make sure that what you've written is perfect before you put it out there. Again, in terms of cons, there's potential here to be grouped with certain authors, whether you think that's appropriate or not. A good example of this is the so-called Golden Age debate, which is involved academics from Britain, Ireland, France, England, Ireland, France, Scotland, Wales, the Low Countries, and so forth, for a good sort of 30 years now. And it's a debate revolving around the degree to which women were able to move into the workforce following the Black Death of the Middle Ages, when there is a big reduction in the population and there's a labor shortage. Now, that entire debate, and I mentioned it here in a little more detail, because that debate started with an article written by Caroline Barron, who I have given you a piece of literature to look at with reference to Form 2, building an argument, the answering a question form. But that debate started with a piece of work by Caroline Barron, and very quickly, almost by accident, it was propped up by a book published by a man named Jeremy Goldberg at the University of York. Now, Goldberg had not written his book in response to Barron's article. It just happened that he was finishing a book that came from his PhD, in fact, just after Barron's article came out. And so very quickly, and really ever since then, when it comes to this debate about were women successful or were they not successful in entering the economy at a time of labor shortage, people always say, well, there's the Barron-Goldberg side of the debate, and then there's the other side of the debate. And in fact, Barron and Goldberg themselves say, we don't think we should be in the same group. If you look closely, we're not saying the same thing. But despite their own sort of protestations, a generation of academics now have always considered them together. Now, that can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. If you write an article which you think can resolve a debate and it goes into the mix, you'll find that as an academic, you will be put in one camp or the other camp. Oh, you are a side A of the argument academic. And sometimes that means that you're then closely associated in people's minds with academics that you might not think are good academics, that you think perhaps don't produce good research. There's a danger there of your reputation being damaged. Debate pieces can represent the third article in a debate. So point of view A is followed by point of view B, and you write the third article in which you settle the debate. And maybe an entire academic debate only stretches over 3 articles. More commonly, though, debates, despite best efforts, are not resolved. And so your article intending to resolve a debate might be the 33rd article in that debate. It's not unusual. I give you an example here, the so-called Brenner debate I've put in the web address here. You can look it up on Wikipedia for a summary. And just on that one Wikipedia page are maybe 25 articles where people either agree with Brenner or disagree with Brenner. And just to give you a short précis, the Brenner debate is a debate that says, the debate about the degree to which political circumstances can shape the development of economic institutions. Sorry, that really understates it. But effectively, one side of the Brenner debate, the side Brenner is not on, says that labor shortages and after the Black Death in Western Europe resulted in the liberation of unfree serfs and the kind of roots of a capitalist society. On the other hand, the reason that a capitalist society did not begin to emerge in Eastern and Central Europe is because at the same point in time after the Black Death, unfree peasants were not liberated because the ruling class effectively led a really brutal crackdown and repression. And so the argument here is, and that Brenner puts forward, is that the political circumstances actually can take precedence over the trajectory of social and economic development, whereas non-Brenner academics say, no, that's not necessarily true. It's the demographic and economic factors are more important than the political factors. It's a bit of a silly debate when you get down to it. But again, have a look at it here. You'll see lots of articles there from people who think they can resolve this debate, but they really can't. If you're writing a debate piece, and again, these sort of structural issues I point out here are kind of specific ones that are supplementary to the structure of the generic Anglo-American article. They don't replace those generic structures. This is supplementary information, as it is for each of these forms of building an argument. In the introduction, you want to, again, if you're coming to a debate, given the lag time between when things are published and when new things are published, you need to say, is this topic still relevant? Why do we really need to understand this correctly? You need to restate both theses or perceived theses you will be challenging. You need to very clearly say, side A and side B of the debate are this and this. You need to provide references to show that both sides of the debate, both theses, are in recent and continuous use, i.e., this has not yet been resolved. What you will find sometimes is that a debate may not have been resolved in published articles, say, but in fact it will have been resolved by the fact that the current generation of academics have simply quit citing one side of the debate. The Brenner debate is a good example of this, that the Brenner debate was a hot topic before the end of communism in 1990 because it connected with a wider argument that the kind of political superstructure could really derail what we might think of as a natural economic growth and the development of social institutions. After the fall of communism, people stopped caring so much about that debate. The kind of, again, I misrepresent this to a certain degree, but the kind of more sort of pro-capitalist side of the argument won that debate, not because there was a definitive article published. There are still some Brenner historians out there, but rather because academics lost interest in that debate after the fall of communism because it had connected to these wider discussions. So you need to provide references to say that academics are still working on both sides of the debate and it's still a live issue. In the argument, you're going to want to align key points of the two theses to make clear how they differ in the main ways in which they differ. Make explicit the significance of the differences to future research and understanding. Bring your evidence to bear and check it systematically against each of the key points where the two theses may be aligned with one another. State clearly which side of the debate your evidence supports, and don't split the baby, as they say. You're probably familiar with this expression, to split the baby. It refers to the justice of King Solomon in the Old Testament, where two women both claim to be the mother of a child, and in a kind of sneaky trick, Solomon says, well, someone get out a sword and we'll resolve this by chopping the baby in half and giving each woman half of the baby. But of course, the woman who genuinely is the mother of the child reveals herself effectively by saying, don't do it, give the child to the other woman. But this has led to the common English expression, don't split the baby. And the significance of that is, don't try and stand on both sides of the argument at the same time, because it destroys your own credibility. You have to choose a side effectively in the main. In terms of conclusion, restate the two theses, restate how you feel you have settled the debate, and you might qualify settling the debate in certain ways. And again, indicate the broader implications. Now, the last of these frameworks for building an argument is the so-called need for comparison. And this is a very broad-based sort of category here, but in a way it's the most complex. There are all kinds of comparisons that academics can make. We could compare regions or countries. We could make demographic comparisons, i.e. we could be looking at the experiences of men versus women, of young versus old, of different ethnic groups, people living in different societies effectively. We could look at different forms of something. We could look at a topic through the lens of art on the one hand and literature on the other hand. Or maybe we could look at a topic by looking at two different kinds of literature. For example, we might be interested in how people perceived a specific topic in the 1880s, and so we look for that topic in newspapers on the one hand, and we look for it in government policy on the other hand. We can conduct comparison across chronologies. We can say, for example, society is faced by the challenge of plague and labor shortage in the 1380s. They have plague and labor shortage again in the 1660s. Is the response of society the same in each period? Is it different? Again, interdisciplinary approaches also offer a form of comparison. We could look at the same topic through sociological methods on the one hand and economic analysis on the other hand. Do the use of these two approaches, when we compare the results offered by each, tell us something unique? We're looking again for comparison of bodies of source materials or techniques or of results. So I'm telling you something a little different here, that we might be comparing on all of these kind of vectors above here, regions, demographics, forms, chronologies, and through interdisciplinary approaches. And for each of those, we might be looking at different bodies of source material or different techniques, or comparing the results thereof. When it comes to pros or cons, some of the pros are these kind of comparative studies will often garner a wider audience and a wider readership, which can be good for advancing your career and driving up your impact in the field. They also demonstrate a degree of interdisciplinarity and allow you to sort of bridge two different academic communities, for example, modern versus medieval historians, or sociologists versus economists, and so forth. Also, they create good opportunities to work with others. I mean, I have to mention this concretely because I'm working here at Copernicus University writing a comparative study of race law and national identity in the Baltic region versus the Irish Sea zone on opposite corners of Europe. This allows me to work with academics from a different regional specialty. Now, on the con side, comparative work can be overwhelming, and very often poor comparative work leads to superficial results. People can't dig deep enough or can't dig deep enough within the constraints of a 10,000-word article to address fairly the nuances of both approaches, both periods, or both bodies of data, for example. Also, comparative work can sometimes be difficult to get accepted for publication, often because of the peer review process. So, for example, I'm producing an article here that compares the process of ethnic integration in urban environments in Prussia versus in Wales. So when if we submit that article to a journal, they may send it to a reviewer who works on Prussia, who won't understand the Welsh evidence and how it's been used, and so they're reluctant to accept it for publication. On the other hand, a reviewer familiar with Welsh history might not understand the nuances of the Prussian material, and so, again, feel reluctant to approve it for publication. It's difficult sometimes, even with the best comparative work, to get it accepted for publication. You'll find that comparative work tends most often to be based in edited volumes, for example, where you can put several articles by different authors side by side to create comparisons. You need to really make clear the need for comparison right at the beginning of any such article or PhD chapter. You have to justify the comparison, and the ways that you have to do that are to align the literature of both fields. You need to say, look, academics in both areas have addressed effectively the same questions. It may not be obvious they were asking the same questions, but if I explain it to you, then you can see the points of intersection or points of natural convergence of both fields. If you're talking about history and you're comparing two regions, for example, or two time periods, that can often be much easier than if you're undertaking comparative work where two different disciplines have effectively addressed the same question. For example, sociologists on the one hand and economists on the other hand. It's not always so obvious that they're dealing with the same topic. You need to derive a set of common questions and indicate the special significance of a shared answer. I'll come back to that in a second here because it's very important. The argument needs to be absolutely systematic. In each section, you need to deal with one side of the comparison, the one field or data set, and then the other, always in the same order. So A and B in section 1, A and B in section 2, A and B in section 3. Always in the same order. You really have to be very careful to organize the information in the mind of your reader with comparative work. Be consistent. And again, I return here in conclusion, the key is to prove that this was a useful exercise. There's no point in conducting comparative work if your only conclusion is that the same thing happened in both circumstances. You must offer a unique conclusion that is only achievable through comparative study. It is not enough to say, well, I looked at what was happening in London in the 1580s and Paris in the 1580s, and it's pretty much exactly the same thing at exactly the same time in exactly the same order. That's not exciting information. Particularly if you're talking about some general observation and you're checking it against two places. You really have to justify that you're reaching a conclusion wherein that conclusion tells us something unique and interesting. A conclusion that can only be reached by comparing these two places. Just go to JSTOR and search the word comparative in the search box. You will be overwhelmed with articles that have the word comparative in the title. Have a look at the introduction of a few of those in your own field study. Now I'm going to wrap up this lecture here by coming back to the assessment for this module, because after this lecture you're in a position to undertake the first item of assessment. Notice that in the original assessment criteria, 10% of the overall result was dictated by your attendance. Obviously, because we're now teaching online due to the coronavirus, no one is attending in person, and so I'm issuing here new assessment criteria. We now have two items of assessment only. Item 1, for 60% of your result, is a written assessment of the structure, language, and style of 3 key works in your field, namely 1 book and 2 articles. That is to say, you have 1,000 to 1,200 words for the whole assignment. That is, say, 400 words per each item you assess. Again, I stress here, the assessment you give to me at the end of this course, no later than the 27th of April, will be a total of no more than 1,200 words. This should be submitted in English, in Times New Roman font, 12-point font, double-spaced. And you must employ footnote references so that it's clear where you have cited things in the work you're assessing. Provide those references in the MHRA style. If you Google MHRA style, you will find a free MHRA style guide. In fact, you'll find many of them on the internet. The notation itself is not included in your word count. You will submit this piece of work by email directly to me at m.f.stevens@v.umk.pl. Again, I'll try and give you a little more information on that assessment as we go forward, but this is 1 month ahead of the assessment deadline. This should be a relatively easy exercise where you take 1 book and 2 articles that you have already read, ideally. You open a single document and you write 300 or 400 words on each one of those, in which you say, look, this is how the author has structured it. They may have used one of the 5 approaches I've outlined here. If you think they've used a different way of formulating their argument, that's fine. You need to make it clear. Each of those little assessments should include a few key quotations that make it clear to me as the reader why you think that each of those items has been structured in the way you're saying they have been structured. Okay, item of assessment number 2. You will still receive 40% of your mark based on a text of a 3-minute thesis presentation. I am hoping that by the time of our last scheduled session on the 27th of April, that we will be able to meet in person, and you will be required to attend and present your 3-minute thesis. And you will also submit to me a written transcript of your 3-minute thesis in English. A 3-minute thesis, I give you the definition here, is a competition held internationally now, in which PhD students summarize their thesis in 180 seconds. This should be engaging, it should be easy to understand, and you should formulate your 3-minute summary of your PhD using one of the methods of setting out an argument that I have explained in this lecture here. Just go on YouTube, search 3-minute thesis, and you will find hundreds of examples you can listen to in which academics discuss their research in just 3 minutes.